So as always, we've got the agenda. I'll bring it up really quickly so you've got an idea about what's going on. Okay, so this is our agenda. Um, Drop a link in the chat. If I was prepared, I've done this before. Okay, so that link in the chat is to the agenda. Feel free to add notes or your names or anything like that. So yeah, we'll begin with a quick welcome. Going to have a recap of what we've done the last month. So I'll give a quick presentation on what the experiment was that we ran. Then we'll have Jono's amazing talk, which I'm really excited for. And then we'll round off with a look towards the next month. So just a kind of overview of what we're planning to do with this next experiment. And then we can end with the discussion. So I'll begin with an acknowledgement. Just stop my share. So yeah, acknowledging traditional custodians on the lands on which we gather and paying respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And just reminding everybody that we're operating under a covenant, which everybody agreed to when they registered for this event. And that is basically outlining our vision, mission, and values, and also our expectations. So the idea is that even just by attending this meeting, we are participating in a radical experiment where we're recognizing one another's contributions. And so, yeah, I guess this is usually a space for anyone new that would like to introduce themselves. In the very first council, we spent 15 minutes meeting everybody. And so we've got a record of most people who are in the room, but if anyone is new and they'd like to introduce themselves, now's a good time. Maybe just let us know where you're from and maybe a community or a project that you're passionate about.
You go.
Hi. Okay. I don't know. I'm fine with Megan, you go. No? Okay. So yeah, I think last time I joined and the first time I joined, I didn't get to say hi because I was dropping in from another call. Anyway, so hi, my name is Natasha. I'm from Germany. And I actually was asked by Cooper, or he sent out the link to me because we had met last year during Edge City in Chiang Mai. So that is how I got to be here. And in my last job, I was a foresight practitioner and digitalization innovation expert for a very large corporation. I left the company, but I'm still at heart in the future and ethics business. And now just seeing whoever is out there that I would like to work for or work with. And yeah, I don't know. And I like Cooper. Somehow we had a good chat. So now I'm here just to see what I can do, what I can help with, because my brain needs work. I want to work. Right. That's more or less about me.
Thanks, Natasha. Great to have you. Megan.
Hi. Um, I'm a good mate of Coop's from a while back now. We, for our sins, both did PhDs at Queensland Brain Institute at the same time or thereabouts. And yeah, um, I'm still based in Queensland, just outside of Brisbane at the moment, on Gubbi Gubbi and Yagara country. And I'm just interested. I've dipped out of this whole process for a long time, had academic burnout. So I call myself a recovering academic. I now work for the federal government, which is has much better conditions. And so now I might have that brain space and capacity outside of work to actually maybe get a bit more involved again. Since I've basically just barely been there when Cooper started to talk about this and breathe life into it and told him it was a good idea, but it didn't help any further. So hopefully I can help a bit now. Thanks, Coops.
Thanks, Mega. Thanks for coming. And we've got Asley reaching out in the chat. You were in former meetings, but for the reminders, based in Cologne, Germany, and interested in the role of community-led initiatives in digital knowledge commons in Bonn. So Perhaps that's something for Natasha, who I think you said you're also in Germany. Anyone else like to introduce themselves before we kick off?
I'll just say hi briefly because I'm presenting, so you'll get a longer bio from me. But I'm Jonathan Sriranganathan, and I'm in Brizzy, and I'm very excited to be joining this discussion and sharing some thoughts with you. I've known Cooper and Megan for a while now, and it's cool to be reconnecting and thinking deeply about system change.
It really is. Thanks, Johnny. Anyone else? Last chance. Okay, I'm gonna share. So yeah, this first part is basically a recap of what we did the last month. I thought because there might be some new people, it's always a good idea to have a bit of repetition what it is we're doing here, especially for Jono's sake. So just very, very briefly, I'll go through the kind of mission and what we're doing, and then I'll walk us through the process and results from last month's experiment. So our basic goal and our mission is to create an open scientific system that can quantify the collective value of any contribution with respect to any particular community's goals and values. And the mechanism that we're doing this with is something that we've developed in-house through this process of experimentation at OHM. And we're calling this meta-valuation. And the basic idea is that somebody can compare two contributions at a time on some dimension of interest. And then the unique thing that we do is we include those valuations in the set of contributions to be valued. So if you zoom out and you consider these pairwise valuations that people are doing as valuable contributions in their own right, then we can award them each with one standard unit of value and use that as a baseline for the entire system. And so because we're then valuing valuations, we need this process, which is where the word meta-valuation comes in. That's the exact same simple process, but we're now just comparing some regular contribution to some number of these pairwise valuations. So that's probably too rapid, but it's also, for reasons I'll explain later, not super necessary to understand the intricacies of that model for now. We have validated this model across various communities now, so spanning festivals, conferences, decentralized projects, more recently this year, a residency in India. And so the first thing this has shown is that this same mechanism can apply to very, very different contributions. In fact, we haven't found a contribution which it doesn't apply to yet. And then the second thing that's really interesting is we've explored different values of these different communities, and these are expressed in the system as dimensions. And so you can see in that column that there's a dimensions column. These are all the different dimensions that we've measured through these different prototypes. You can see that there's one common dimension across all of them, that is gratitude, but we've also explored a number of different dimensions, some of which have been very successful, others have not been so successful. And what this creates then is what you might think of as a values landscape. So we have all these different communities that are expressing the value of their contributions in different ways. But if any of those communities have common dimensions, then it enables efficient coordination between them. And so as a proof of concept, we've maintained gratitude as a common dimension across all of our prototypes. And this means that all of the different contributions have been valued on this gratitude dimension. And in theory, all of these communities could start to coordinate using this dimension of gratitude. Through this process, we've also realized that having a dimension that's tied to the community mission is really valuable because firstly, it's objective. So it's something that you can actually point to, like a written mission statement that says, this is what we are here to do. And it means that things can be valued with respect to that mission objective. The other thing it's really powerful for then is coordination between communities that are aligned in their missions. Because if any two communities are heading in the same direction, let's say that they believe in an open science future, then those two communities might agree that they could coordinate using that mission dimension. And let's say they might agree that the OHM metrics that we develop are interchangeable with another community's dimensions that they develop. So these two dimensions, mission and gratitude, are core dimensions that we're going to be embedding into our MVP. But beyond that, there's obviously lots of other intricate ways that you might measure the quality of contributions. And the idea is that this is a multidimensional system. And so to return to the prototypes that we've run, of all of the prototypes, the most sophisticated way that we've selected values so far has been in the AMOS study. And what we did there was we ran a survey where we invited people to tell us what values they thought should be represented in this study. And then we just selected the most popular ones. So we ended up with this list of 5 dimensions aside from gratitude. So those were generosity, inclusivity, transparency, integrity, and creativity. And they were simply selected because they were the most commonly nominated dimensions, which obviously is a fairly biased way to select things. It's at least community sampling, but it really is kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, you know, like those people that put in the most popular values, they got selected. And so it's a fairly biased way to select dimensions. And so our goal with this prototype was to develop a more rigorous way to select dimensions. And this is really the first, well, this is firstly something that came up quite a lot with discussion with these communities that we've been prototyping with. One of the big questions is, but how do you select the values to begin with? And firstly, I think the values that we've come up with, mission and gratitude, are actually quite universal and work as really strong primary dimensions. But then we need a more sophisticated way to select kind of secondary dimensions that might speak to specific characteristics of contributions. And so what we intended with this experiment of this month is to use the wisdom system itself to select a set of values for OM. And we had a few goals going into it. So firstly, just to generate a ranked list of core values and dimensions that are important to the community and our mission. Secondly, a kind of stretch goal is that we might potentially use those in the wisdom system itself. So we may begin at some point in the future to evaluate contributions with respect to this list we generated. And then the third goal really was to embed into our documents. And this is as a proof of concept for progressive decentralization, which I'll loop back to. And so the basic structure we had was 4 meetings. We'll repeat this same structure every month for the coming year. And so the first meeting was our first OM council. It was also our first council in over a year. So it was just a chance to reconnect in large part. But the goal of that was to set the intentions for the coming month. Then in the second council, we nominated values. So we used a form where people could list any value and provide a description. We ended up with 30 nominations, but there were some duplicates in that list. And so we whittled that down to a list of 25 unique values. And we used ChatGPT to normalize the descriptions so that they were in a standard format and people could compare them sensibly. From there, the next council meeting was to vote on those values. And so here's where we used our wisdom prototype. And people were just doing these pairwise comparisons. So it was, value A versus value B, and tell us which is more important to the mission. And so during the session, we completed a complete prototype. You can see that under the label community on the right here. And so that gave us this top 10 list, beginning with regeneration, integrity, and community. After we finished that, which was all done live in this mammoth 2-hour session, and thank you to everybody who participated, we realized that there were some populations of the community that weren't very well represented. And so I reached out to some of the founding members of OM and invited them to complete a new prototype. And so we completed this asynchronously and then ended up with this second completed prototype, which shows a slightly different set of values. And so that's listed under the Encore column there. And so what we found, first of all, is that there's some similarities, but there's also some differences. And then we had an interesting question as to how to amalgamate and combine those data sets. And so this was the goal of the 4th meeting, where we came together, we looked at the results, and we decided that we would just do a simple addition across these 2 data sets. And this then gave us a combined rank order, our first rank order list of values that are important to OM. And so this is the top 10 you can see on the right, beginning with integrity, consent, regeneration, and going all the way down to thing. And so this is, first of all, a proof of concept that we can use this same process to define our values. But secondly, what we did is then embed this into our governance docs. So on the bottom right, you can see the new section that is in the covenant. And some of you might have read this or noticed the difference. And so there's a section on the values. which previously just said something fairly generic, like we are inspired by the open science, Burning Man, and permaculture movements, and then listed some of the values from those movements. But what it says now is much more specific, and it explains that we've run this experiment and we've now embedded our top 10 list of values into that covenant. And so the idea is that this is not final. This is an iterative process. We're really just beginning to understand what values are important to us and our mission. But this is a proof of concept for a constantly evolving document that can shift and change as we do along with the project into the future. And so that is the term that I mean, progressive decentralization. Like right now, we are still very centralized in the sense that I wrote the original draft of this document and have been driving a lot of this project for the last few years. But the idea is that that's antithetical to our goal as an organization to become completely decentralized and autonomous. And so this is a proof of concept for how we can progressively decentralize over time, decentralizing in ways as we can, but without putting the overall risk, mission and purpose at risk as we do so, which coincidentally we often see in the decentralized space. When you decentralize too quickly, things can implode, and then the overall health of the community or the system that you're creating deteriorates. So yeah, so on the whole, I'd say it was successful. Really excited that we had a successful first month's experiment. We demonstrated this way that we can map values across different sectors of the community. And we found that there were different subsets of values that apply to different subsets of the community. Something that I think was really like interesting to observe and I wanted to highlight a bit here is that there are different ways to play the game. And this came out really quickly when we were doing the voting process, because some people raged ahead and did lots and lots of comparisons in a very short period of time. Other people were much more considered and spent minutes on each comparison, and then even sometimes wrote a little description explaining their choice. And our goal at OM is to recognize all these different forms of value with respect to our mission. The question is, how do we actually value these over time? And so I wanted to give a little bit of a window into the mechanism that we used here, just highlighting that in this example, we didn't actually do the meta-valuation process. And the reason for that is that you can't compare something intangible like a value to something very concrete like a number of pairwise valuations that somebody's done, because they're just on different scales. But what we can do is the first part of the process, and that was the pairwise valuation process where people were comparing two values. And critically, what we did is every time somebody compares two values, we reward them with one standard unit of value, which we're calling an omnom. And so that is what I wanted to, thanks, Megan. And so that's what I wanted to dig into a little bit more, because this question of what is an omnom came up during this process. And particularly the way that we're rewarding people right now created a bit of tension and some interesting discussions about what this process is and exactly, yeah, motivated me wanting to unpack it a bit. And so I have to keep moving my screen, sorry. Yeah, and so this slide is just to explain a bit of what an omnom is about. It is a standard unit of value to the OM mission. And more precisely, what that means is the average value of a single pairwise vote in wisdom. And so when people were doing this comparison, and some people were moving really quickly, some people were moving really slowly, right now, our best estimate of the value of these votes is to just give one omnom per vote. That's the best information we have. But over time, this can potentially change, right? Because we might learn over time that that person that was shooting ahead and doing lots of comparisons in a very brief time wasn't doing them very reliably. And we already have some measures in the system where we can start to look at this sort of thing. And so in the future, it might be that that person's score gets downweighted with respect to the true value to the community. But all of this is determined with this same mechanism and through community consultation over time. And so the idea is to not get too hung up right now on what your particular score is or what the value of your particular vote is, and recognize that this is an evolving process where we're going to learn over time what is valuable. And our goal will be to constantly be checking in with the community and recognizing and rewarding people fairly for the value they provide. And so with that sort of preface, yeah, I wanted to kind of highlight that we do have now a leaderboard. And so you can see on the top right that this is the leaderboard of this current council series. Obviously, there's been a bunch of prototypes leading up to this, but just looking at this current council series, that's the current leaderboard. And then I think then points to the main reason why we need and are embedding this process into the system, which is to incentivize engagement. Because if people are motivated by the idea of getting om-noms, then they're going to be motivated to engage with the system. And that's going to encourage them to give us the data that we actually need if we're going to evolve the system, if we're going to figure out what contributions are worth, and so on. And so that is the first reason for why we need om-noms. Second reason is efficient coordination within the community. Because as I said, if we're tracking the value of all these contributions and everything's getting recognized fairly, then it enables people to coordinate and basically just give freely to the community, trusting that the system is going to reward them fairly over time. And then the third main reason that we need om-noms is coordination with other communities. I touched on this briefly, but if we develop om-noms and then some other community like High Valley Dawn develop their own token that represents value to their mission, then we might agree that our missions are sufficiently aligned, and then we can start trading and engaging at a collective level. And all of this can be done automatically through the system, in theory. So that's the kind of why, the what, the how it works. Yeah, I'll put some properties over here. I think one thing I just wanted to highlight is that they're not a traditional token in the sense that you don't own them. They are more a representation of value, and that means that it can shift and change over time. So it's not like a traditional blockchain system where you receive a token and that's yours. It's not an asset. It's more a measure of value that can adapt and update over time as we get more data into the system. Okay, so I feel like I've ranted for quite a while, conveniently coming to the end of my pitch. So that's been the first month. We are, oh yeah, actually, yeah, the point I wanted to leave off on was somebody asked what you can do with them. And so one of the things that you can do with these om-noms is attend gatherings. So at the end of the year, we're going to be hosting another om gathering. The idea is that you can effectively purchase your way, even though, as I said, it's not ownership, so you don't actually own them to purchase, but you will be gifted a place at om gathering based on the om-noms that you have. And so some of these can be earned just literally through doing reviews. And if that's the way that you want to contribute, then great, because we need a lot of data and we need people to engage with the system. So if all you want to do is sit there and attend our meetings and vote on the things that we ask you to vote on, then that's fantastic, because you'll be giving us the data that we need to evolve. And then you can attend and you can enjoy all of the gifts that other people bring along, whether it be their workshops or their art that they create, and so on. And also to just highlight, this is still in flux, but we're also planning, in addition to om gathering, a number of theme camps. So there are some Burning Man events coming up, like Simplify, potentially Third Degree, and Confest, where we're thinking we might host some om theme camps. And so potentially this engagement with those activities could also form part of this system. And Angie's also crafting some really beautiful ideas for a series of Rising Heart gatherings that would potentially interweave with these other gatherings. So that's just a kind of window for the year ahead. And I thought, yeah, before I introduce Jono, I'll just give a space for any critical questions if anyone has any to ask about the experiment we've run or the general system that we're developing. Any questions? It's fine if not. I'll just take it as a sign that I nailed it.
You did nail it.
You did. That's very good.
Especially with the prolific use of puns, that any word that can fit an om in it, you put the om in there. It makes me very happy.
Yeah, me too. It's a very punny word. It just seems to fit into everything. It's a great word to pun with.
I have one question, and it might sound controversial, but I'll throw it out there anyway. So I love what you built here and what everyone's kind of contributed to. But as far as and I love the fact that it's going to be decentralized and you're starting as a centralized system. But if you say compare this to you can slap me in the face for asking this, but if you compare this to the Chinese social credit system, how is there protection from this becoming going down that route, as apart from the decentralization factor?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can answer it. I'm not going to be able to bring it up quick enough in time, but I can answer it by returning to one of our core values, which is second on the list, which is consent. Because a Chinese social credit system
True.
has some kind of consent, I guess. You're consenting to be part of, but you don't really consent, right? There's no consent. You're forced in a way to become part of that society that is then judging you in a way. Whereas we are creating a completely voluntary consent-based system where you can choose to engage if you want. And if not, please go and do your thing. We don't want people to be forced in any way. But if you find value in what you're doing and you think that it's useful to you and your community, then jump on board and co-create. I think that's the key difference.
No, it's a good answer. I like it.
I guess I'd also say that I think what we're doing is much more, I mean, I don't really know the mechanics of what they're doing because I don't think it's very transparent. And that's the other thing that we're doing is everything's transparent. It's all based on open science principles. It's rigorous. It's open to feedback. We actually welcome feedback and will reward constructive feedback, which I would argue is probably not a feature of their system. Okay, so wanting to...
I thought Natasha had a question as well.
Oh, yeah?
Yes. Because you mentioned that you wanted to, at some point in time, look into, let's say, the contribution, now looking at the votings, for example, the votes that one cast. If someone is just shooting down the road and doing click, 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 or really thinking about it, I mean, how do you really want to evaluate the level of contribution there and the value of it? And how do you really want to grasp whether or not that person that is really, really quick in doing all those comparisons has used all of their brains and soul to do those or not? I mean, this is something very internal.
It is very internal, yes. And yeah, it's a great question. We are limited by the data that we have. And so we're limited by the experimental paradigm we can create. What we've done in the current version is to have test-retest. So there are occasions when people have been given A versus B and then also B versus A. So what we can do is look at their reliability across those tests, and we can show that some people are more reliable or less reliable. Right now, that's about the extent of what we can do. There's probably some more sophisticated analyses we can do. But yeah, we're very much limited by the paradigm and also the amount of data that we collect. But over time, we can learn more and more about the way people respond, and we can learn whether people are very consistent in their behavior or whether they have particular biases, say, for example, against one particular person or one particular contribution type or whatever it might be. And that can be data that we can bring to the surface and use it to educate the community, potentially like try and correct that bias. But yeah, you're right. It is internal. And in some ways, actually, like I actually celebrate the person who jumped ahead and did a bunch of data because as they expressed to me, we had a lot of data to get through and we need a lot of reviews. And in some ways, the pairwise mechanism is designed, we use it in science because it is quite robust and it is really quick to get a lot of data. And so what you find is that if you just give people a lot of these comparisons at a rapid rate, when you look at the sum activity, you get a really accurate representation of what it is they truly value. And so that's kind of the effect that we're going for. But that's also not to say that the people that took much more time and added a written description also didn't add value. And I think in the future, we'll find that those written descriptions were actually quite valuable. We just don't have a mechanism to value them super quickly and efficiently right now. We need more data and the app, to be honest.
Thanks.
Welcome. Great question. John, I saw that you said that there's some exaggerations of the Chinese social credit system.
Oh no, just that I think people refer to it like because I've seen the Black Mirror.
That was what I was.
Yeah, which is fucking
portrayed
terrifying.
badly, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but my understanding is that that's not really a thing in China at the moment. I believe that it could be, but I think sometimes in the West we're like, oh, China's got this social credit system, and I don't actually think they do. I think it's just a sort of exaggerated financial.
I'll have a read of the Wikipedia thing after this, and
yeah, I don't know.
It's interesting.
Not a big thing.
Yeah, like after watching that Black Mirror thing, I was like, whoa.
Yes,
but that's why you can never believe everything you see in the media, right?
But yeah, like personally, I'm very skeptical of any kind of credit and ranking systems, because I'm more in the headspace of just give what you can and hope that there won't be too many freeloaders, which is a different philosophical approach perhaps. But anyway, broader conversation for another day. Should I jump into things, Coops?
Yeah, I think so. On that note, yeah, introducing Jono. So for those of you who don't know, Jonathan Sriranganathan, I always call you Jono Sri, so forgive me.
That's so fine, yeah.
Was our first Greens councillor in Queensland, elected on a grassroots movement, and is not just a really great politician that's been experimenting with participatory democracy, but also an artist, a poet, a musician, and so I feel really exemplifies the combination of heart and mind. And he has prepared a talk on his experiences with participatory democracy. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, mate. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm really honored that people are interested in what I have to say. I'm not sure that this slideshow is working too well, but I also didn't make this slideshow specifically for tonight. It was more just pulled something together from previous presentations. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about a very, very rushed critique of representative or conventional forms of hierarchical democracy. Then I'm going to share a little bit of an overview of some of the trials of participatory democracy I engaged in during my 7 years as a city councillor. And then I'll sort of extrapolate a few sort of broad lessons that came out of that for me, and that may or may not be relevant to this particular project, but I hope it's useful for some. The first kind of broad critique I wanted to offer is that what a lot of us think of as democracy is not really very democratic. This slide represents decision making within Brisbane City Council, but the broad problem is the same across different parliaments and different forms of representative democracy. You can see here, for me as a city councillor in my 7 years, I had something like 30,000 plus residents in my electorate. So I was one Greens councillor representing over 30,000 voters. It was close to 50,000 people once you include kids and non-citizens. Now you can see very quickly that all those people, I'm their local councillor. They supposedly want to have access to me and tell me what they think about things, and I want to be consulting them and asking them what they think about stuff. But there's no way that one human being can meaningfully represent the views of 30,000 plus people. So you inevitably get this hierarchy where I, as a local councillor, I'm not listening to everyone equally. Maybe I'm more heavily influenced by like the president of the soccer club or some small business association or whatever it is in different jurisdictions. So already power is very heavily concentrated. You've got the voices and perspectives of needs of tens of thousands of people all channeled into one elected representative. And then that one elected representative is again part of a broader hierarchy where I'm one city councillor out of 26 councillors in Brisbane, but you can think of state and federal parliaments in Australia where there might be 90, 100, 150 members of parliament. So each of those members of parliament are all jockeying for influence and sharing perspectives and represent the needs of their electorate. But that there's already two layers of separation between the people they're actually representing. And corruption creeps into the system because as power is heavily centralized, you've got a small number of people making a lot of big decisions. They don't have time to talk to everyone who's affected by those decisions, but they can be easily manipulated by big corporations, in the case of local government, property developers, but you can extrapolate and imagine comparisons for any other form of decision making. So there are some very significant problems with what we might call hierarchical representative democracy. And I would argue that it's not real democracy at all. It's sort of shallow simulacrum of democracy that was kind of created to pacify the masses and make people think that they were getting a say when really all you're doing is voting every 3 or 4 years and crossing your fingers that someone's going to listen to you. So during my 7 years as a city councillor, I started experimenting with different forms of participatory democracy. We had, a lot of the traditional like community meetings, town hall forums, circle discussions in public parks. This one from a few years ago that you can see on screen, this was a bunch of renters talking about what should the Greens policies on renters' rights be here in Queensland. And these sorts of discussions end up shaping the policy platform that the Greens as a political party advocates for at the local and state and national government levels. I also did lots of other sorts of participatory trials. Like we had these park planning sessions where the residents could make suggestions on how they wanted a local park designed. Perhaps most interesting for this group is that we did trial different forms of online voting as well. And I'll take a moment here to, I'm not sure that these slides are particularly useful. I'll just try and explain it. Basically, we used a form of decision-making that's commonly called participatory budgeting. This has been heavily utilized in Brazil, cities like Porto Alegre, but different countries around the world have adopted participatory budgeting to different extents. Basically, you take a budget, maybe it's like a small organization like a football club, or maybe it's an entire government entity, and they're deciding, how do we spend our money? And the process is essentially residents or citizens or participants in the project, they make suggestions, then we find out how much those suggestions would cost to implement, and then everyone has the total budget available to them, and they can allocate votes accordingly. So the biggest trials we ran for me as a city councillor is that I had a budget of about $500,000 for park upgrades. So money that people could spend on the council would normally spend on basketball courts or footpaths or playgrounds or whatever. And we said, rather than me as the one politician, as the one elected representative saying, I want the basketball court here, I want the playground there, we held this community voting system, participatory budgeting, where people made suggestions. We said, well, you want a basketball court in that park, this is how much it's going to cost. Oh, you want a footpath upgrade here, this is how much that'll cost. We got the ideas costed, we checked that they were feasible, and then everyone voted via the online platform. There was upvoting, downvoting options, but broadly speaking, people had $500,000 that they could allocate. And we tended to find that whereas normally politicians will allocate a lot of money to one or two really big flashy projects, when we gave residents a vote, we tended to see that people prioritized smaller local stuff that was immediately relevant to their local area. So we've done a lot of different trials over the years. I don't have time to go into them all in this short presentation, but I'll post a link in the comments to a journal article for anyone who's interested in further reading. Our biggest experiments had around 1,000 people actively participating. And one of the challenges I navigated as an elected representative was that I had 30 to 50,000 people in my electorate, but I was only ever getting up to 1,000 people actively participating in the system. So that kind of creates a question of legitimacy. If only 1,000 people are participating, but there's 30,000 people who are being affected by these decisions, is it right for me as an elected representative to say, well, I'm just going to listen to those 1,000 people and the other 29,000 people who voted for me and said, hey, Jono, we trust you to make these decisions. Is that equitable and fair? And I obviously decided that, yes, I think it's better that all those 1,000 people get a say rather than it just being me making up my own mind. But that illustrates that contrast between participatory democracy and representative democracy. Because some people would, and we surveyed people about this, we did some big community surveys, and when we surveyed the people of Brisbane's inner south side, I think our biggest survey response had 3,000 or 4,000 respondents. And we said to people, do you like the community voting? And there was a real sliding scale. Roughly like a quarter of survey respondents said, yes, we really love community voting. We think it's great when the residents themselves get to make the decision. Then there was another quarter or so of people who said, oh, look, I really love the online engagement and I love being able to have a say, but Jono, I think you should still make the final decision based on that feedback that we've given you. And then the sort of sliding scale, there was still a fair chunk of people who were like, no, Jono, I don't want to get involved in all these little local government decisions. I elected you. I'm just entrusting you to make the decisions. So there's a real disparity in terms of how people wanted to relate to government decision making. A few other interesting lessons that came out of those different participatory democracy trials. One which will probably be obvious to everyone here, or it's kind of intuitive, is just that people only participate where they feel like there's a tangible, meaningful outcome. There are so many government consultations. There are so many organizations doing surveys and saying, what's your opinion about this? Or how do you feel about this? But we had a pretty good participation rate when we engaged in when the actual decision had a tangible outcome. So with our participatory budgeting for park upgrades, people voted, they might vote for the basketball court, and then 6 months later it's getting built. So they could see that there was a tangible return on the time they'd invested. They could see it was actually worth something. Whereas other local council consultations, and Brisbane City Council runs consultations all the time, you fill out the survey or you click a thing on a map and say, I want this here, but you don't really know how the feedback's being used. You don't know how it's being weighted. And so you a little bit kind of stabbing in the dark. And often people just be like, well, it's not worth my time because I could fill out this survey, but I reckon the council's just going to do whatever the property developers want anyway. So tangible outcomes is really important for getting those higher participation rates and for people to participate more meaningfully. We did also find, of course, that people do self-select, and some people really care about where the park benches get installed and other people don't, and that's fine. And the fact that out of the 30 or 40,000 residents in my electorate, only 1,000 wanted to participate in that kind of decision making, that tells us something. What we did also notice, though, was that there's kind of a really tough choice to be made between maximizing participation and accessibility versus quality of deliberation. And I think this is something we were sort of alluding to in Cooper's presentation as well, which is just that we could get hundreds, sometimes 1,000 plus people participating in an online vote, where they read a short summary of the decision, they read a few quick arguments about what's in, and then they just click a couple of buttons. And that's cool. It was people were able to participate remotely. Whereas when we also held our community meetings and we got people in face-to-face, there was a greater level of deliberation and thoughtful consideration. In particular, we saw people saying, oh, well, now that I've had time to hear the perspective of that person with a disability, or, oh, I've heard the perspective of a young mum with kids and she uses the park differently to how I use the park. By creating those spaces for participation and deliberation, we got, I think, more thoughtful and better quality decisions being made. But we could only ever get 50 or 100 people to rock up to a community meeting. And even when we held those online discussions, we might get 50, 60, 80 people in an online discussion space, taking turns, listening to each other. But the participation rates were never as high as the 1,000 people just voting. And I guess that illustrates an important difference between direct democracy and what we might call participatory democracy or deliberative democracy. So direct democracy, you get an app, you just vote in, you're not really spending a lot of time thinking about it, you're not really necessarily being prompted to hear the perspectives of lots of other people who might be affected by the decision. Whereas participatory democracy requires more time, it requires more commitment from participants, and it requires people to be genuinely interested in the perspectives of others. And so putting aside that local government stuff for a second, I wanted to talk about how we make decisions in the Greens as a political party, at least in Queensland. And it's probably similar to a lot of other Greens parties in different parts of the world. And I should stress here that the Greens have this grand ideal or goal of making lots of big decisions via grassroots participatory democracy. And in practice, what happens is that the political establishment says, no, we need a decision now. You don't have time for all that participatory democracy bullshit. We want the answer now. And so the politicians go off and make the decision, and they kind of ignore or circumvent that participatory democracy stuff. And maybe our German friends on the call might know more about this, but in particular, the German Greens have been accused a little bit of not really doing participatory democracy properly, because now they're in power sharing agreements, they're under pressure to make decisions quickly, and so the politicians just go off and make the decision themselves rather than listening to the broader support base. But within the Greens, our ideal of participatory democracy is not actually generally based on voting, it's based on consensus. And so that means like a majoritarian vote system. Let's say there's 15 people in a room. If 8 or 9 people vote in favor of an option and this other 6 or 7 vote against it, the thing just goes ahead. And those 6 or 7, even if it's quite a large minority, those people in the minority, they're like, oh, I didn't get my way, I just have to deal with it. For volunteer-based organizations, for organizations where people aren't being paid salaries, etc., that kind of majoritarian voting can actually be quite corrosive over time, because if you have a bunch of people who just keep losing the vote and they never get their way, and it always just feels like the majority just does what the majority, and there's this, like, those people who are always outvoted will just start to drop away, and so for volunteer-based organizations, consensus-based decision-making actually can lead to better buy-in. And so consensus involves talking in circles, sometimes talking for a long, long time, until you get close to 95, ideally 100% agreement. You'll always still have a couple of people who aren't on board. And the way the group approaches that is to say, well, look, we've all talked, we've facilitated big discussion, we've heard lots of different perspectives. It sounds like we're pretty close to consensus. Are you going to block consensus? And then we sort of say to those 1 or 2 dissenters, do you feel so strongly about this that you want to block the consensus position? And if they say, yes, I want to block, then we'll put it to a vote if we have to. But it's almost like if we get to the point of having to do a majority vote, we've sort of failed. It's sort of a sign that the community hasn't been cohesive enough or hasn't spent enough time listening to minority voices and perspectives. Because ideally, well, you know, if we're doing a good job of participatory decision making, we should be able to come towards a decision that almost everyone is really, really happy with. That's the goal. But the big challenge is time. And this is the thing that I'm sure the OHM project will be grappling with. Lots of community groups grapple with this, is that to do deliberative democracy or participatory democracy well, people need to have enough time to participate. And what can happen, and what we saw in some of my trials as well, was that privilege plays a big part in how much time people can contribute. So we tended to find that older people who were retired, people who owned their own home and had a bit more money and were less financially precarious, they tended to participate more in our various community voting systems, whether it was the online voting or it was the face-to-face meeting. Older homeowners were overrepresented and younger renters were underrepresented. Even though a lot of those younger renters were like, I'm really interested in this community voting, but they've got 3 jobs. They just don't have time for long meetings. They don't have time to read all the emails, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to be really mindful of correcting for those different privileges and marginalizations. Otherwise, the decision-making is not legitimate. It's just a bunch of baby boomers saying they don't want the basketball court near their house. And do we really listen to them, or do we listen to all the other people who don't have more time? What was really interesting in some of our systems was that we saw different results based on the format. So there was one, a vote about a bridge. Where should the bridge go? Do you even want a bridge? We had a tiered voting system where people could sort of say, I don't want a bridge at all, but then if we need a bridge, I want it to be here. And we gave lots of options, et cetera, et cetera. We found that when we called a big community meeting, 150 people came along. We had some small group breakout sessions. We had lots of different forms of discussion. And as a result of that, those sort of participatory discussion, the attendees generally, like, it was almost like a 70 or 80% of people decided that they were opposed to the bridge. They didn't think it was a good use of money. They said, no, we don't want the bridge. We want the money spent on other things. So those 100 to 150 people reached that conclusion. Whereas we had about 1,000 people participating in an online vote, and the online vote had a lot more support for the bridge. So there was, multiple ways of interpreting that, right? Like, is it just that the people who are most engaged know a bit more and have a bit deeper understanding of what some of the flaws of the proposal were? Is it just that like people who were really anti-bridge were more motivated to show up to a public meeting? So like the benefits of this bridge are widely dispersed. There's thousands of people across the city who will use it and want it to happen, where there's a small core of people who live closer to the bridge and they just don't want it because it's going to block their view of the river. So anyway, the takeaway there is just that the medium and the decision-making process can have a big impact on the outcome. And I've learned that you should never say this is the one right way to always make decisions, or this is the one right way to always do voting. You need to adapt and test and iterate and try to find the right decision-making process for the right outcome. I could talk all night about this stuff, but I might sort of wrap things up there and make more space for discussion. But I just think there are interesting questions around what does deliberation, what does participation really mean, and are we, if we're in a headspace of saying we're just going to elect people to make the decisions for us, are we disempowering ourselves? Are we and how does that sit against the desire for a so-called democracy, right? Like, should decisions be made by everyone who is sort of to some extent affected by the decision or to some extent cares about the decision? Or should decisions be made by the people who are actually going to be implementing the decision and having to do all the work? And that's a really big tension. If everyone's voting and saying, or everyone's having a big consensus-based process and there's 100 people in the room and 95 of them are like, we really want to do it this way, but the 5 people in the room who are actually going to be doing the work, they want to do it a different way, well, that's not going to work out very well either. So democracy is messy. There's no perfect system, but humans have been doing participatory democracy in one form of it or another for hundreds of thousands of years. The dominant model of hierarchical representative democracy, where we vote for politicians and they go off and make decisions, or we vote for representatives and they go, or indeed the approach of everyone voting and 45% of people being pissed off because the vote didn't go their way and they never get their way. Those are actually pretty new phenomena. You can look at throughout the long arc of human history and many different societies and cultures around the world. Consensus-based participatory democracy is much, much more common than representative democracy or majority rules voting systems. So I might leave it there and open up for questions and comments. I'm just reading that first one from Asli. How would I assess the level of liberation ensued in radical democracy compared to former local governments in Brisbane? It's such a good question and a really hard thing to measure. I was just one Greens councillor and most of the city councillors were very, very conservative. So like we had a lot of support and a lot of like positive feedback about what I was doing. I think the best measure of it is that when I was first elected in 2016, the Greens primary vote was about 30%. So, just under 1 in 3 people voted for me. When I ran for re-election in 2020, my primary vote was up towards 45%. So there was this big swing of lots more people voted for me the second time around once they'd seen me in action and seen these kinds of participatory democracy trials that we were running. I don't think that's the only variable that led to more people voting Green, but that's, I guess, the best data we've got. People seem to like it because more people voted for me next time around, and we got a lot of positive feedback via our surveys as well. I think it qualitatively also led to a deeper level of engagement and understanding. And one of the common arguments against participatory democracy is that we can't trust people because they're idiots. Don't let the people decide because they're all just sheep and they'll all make terrible decisions and they'll be swayed by propaganda. We cannot trust them. We, the politicians, or we, the company board of directors, or we, the programmers who know it all, that we'll have to make all the decisions because we can't trust everyone else. But actually what I found and what we find again and again is that when you entrust people with the responsibility of making decisions that have a tangible outcome and where they feel like the decision is important, they self-educate. They start seeking out information. They complain that they haven't been given enough info and they want more info. So people who in other contexts wouldn't pay much attention and would just vote for Bodie McBoatface in the survey about what we should name the new ship because they don't really care. If you give them a really powerful and important decision and you're like, no, this is your money. We're spending millions of dollars on public spaces in your community, they actually take that responsibility seriously. So I think there's, again, a lesson to be learned there around the fact that people can rise to the challenge if the decision is tangible and meaningful enough. Cooper just wanted to note that, people feel free to leave if you have to. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for me on all this?
Yes, I do. Hi. So you touched, or you gave the examples of bridges and parks and all of that, which is quite tangible, right? Things that are, I don't want really to say that they're straightforward because they do have many implications, but in general, let's say they're straightforward decisions. But how do you see all those decisions that have to be made on a more intricate level where you really need to have a bit more knowledge, rather than me now saying, I've never built a house. Okay, I don't know, just put the pillar there and then we'll see how it goes. Would you still give that out to the broader audience to vote on?
This is a really good question. Yeah, and we've had vigorous debates about the extent to which we rely on the wisdom of the crowd versus we rely on experts in specific fields of expertise. And what we always tried to do in the different approaches we took was to ensure that people had access to experts. And some people in the urban planning space talk about how we need to have experts on tap, but we don't want experts on top. Because even when you have someone who might be a real expert in transport planning, they might not know as much about public space design. So they're focused on designing the bike lanes that are going to get people quickest in and out of the city. But the architect who knows a bit more about public space will be aware of like, oh, well, if you design it this way, that's going to have better benefits for small business. So I think recognizing that expertise is often quite siloed or specific to a particular area of interest. But rather than seeing it as a choice between do we trust experts or do we trust everyone, recognize that if we crowdsource decision-making for complex issues, people can have access to expertise. We can have a presentation from the flood engineer come along, or we can invite someone from the financial team to talk about the long-term budget impacts, and we can bring those experts in and they can present to the community that's voting or having a say. Because what happens at the moment in majoritarian decision-making or like representative democracy is that there are those experts and they will just be presenting to the politicians. And so the flood engineer will come along and say to the politicians, well, we really need to do it this way. And the politician will be like, oh, you're the expert, I guess I trust you. But out in the community, there are people with other forms of knowledge. There are some ecologists who say, well, if you redesign the creek this way, this will have a better environmental outcome. And there are people who are concerned about the water supply and they're not as concerned about flooding, et cetera, et cetera. So any complex decision in say, a local government context, there's never just one expert who can be trusted with that. Like there are different people with different levels of expertise and different fields of expertise. But what we sort of gravitated towards with council was that people are also experts in their own lives, and that particularly with something like park design, the people who use the park are well placed to make those decisions. I think that you're kind of right to imply that sometimes there are decisions that you just don't want to crowdsource. But what's important is that the delegates are accountable and transparent, and that they're treated as delegates rather than representatives. And that's a subtle distinction, but you vote for a representative and the representative kind of does whatever they want. Whereas a delegate is supposed to be checking in more regularly with the broader network of people that they're representing or accountable to. And a delegate is generally considered recallable. So whereas politicians, they've got an election every 3 or 4 years and they do whatever they want between time. if a delegate is elected and they're making decisions based on expert evidence or whatever, and people are really, really unhappy with the delegate, they can revoke that delegate's powers immediately and turf them out of their role immediately. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a rambling answer, but it's such a deep question. I think it's really interesting. I have a lot of faith in people, and my trials in participatory democracy taught me that people are not idiots, and that if you give them the information, they rise to the challenge and end up making better decisions than just a couple of so-called experts behind closed doors. Megan?
I guess that discussion made me ponder, have you come across much in the space of a kind of jury duty version of that, where people have a more randomly selected, so you hopefully get that range of just sort of someone who's living their life in that parks where they go every day, and maybe also someone who happens to be an urban planner. They might all be in that room, or you have them as consultants. But because it's sort of randomized, that hopefully over time various decisions people are sampled at some point, and also that they're then a smaller group who can have that in-depth consideration and be presented by experts and become subject matter experts for voting.
Yeah,
Is that something that's been done much in Australia? Have you seen the Greens do that?
I think the term that's often used is like citizen juries, or like sortition is the manner of randomly selecting, and like the Greens are interested in it, and I think there's been a few trials here or there. One of the limitations is just that, like, if you've got a really small group of people and you're entrusting them to make the decisions, you can't always be confident that marginalized voices will be represented. You randomly select 12 people. Maybe you won't have any Aboriginal people in the room, but their perspectives are really important. Whereas when you have those larger crowdsourced kinds of processes, those minority voices are still a minority, but they at least have a platform to share their perspective with the wider group. So you can correct for that with the citizen jury model by saying, okay, you 15 randomly selected people, you're making the decision, but here's a bunch of experts we're going to give you, or not just experts, but like people with specific lived experiences or whatever. And that's how you correct for the absence of marginalized voices within the decision-making body itself. The risk is that someone is still wielding power and making decisions about who the experts are and who the marginal. So like, sure, we randomly select a jury of 15 people. Who is the person that then decides which experts and which marginalized voices will be presented to that random jury? And there's a lot of power then in the curation of the experts and in the presentation of the knowledge. Whereas a larger crowd, you've got a sort of broader dispersal of knowledge, I guess. I think the two go hand in hand, and there are some processes where a small group of people with a lot of time can make really good decisions, and randomly selecting them is often better than elections where it's just a quick question of who spends the most money gets the seat. But you also have to resource it properly, because a lot of those citizen assembly processes, they have the same problem that I had, which is just that only retirees turn up. So they randomly select 20 people, they write to them all, they say, congratulations, you're on the jury to design our new Olympic stadium. And only 5 older people rock up, and then they have to do another round of sortition to fill the other 15 spots. And then again, it's just, so not, unless you're paying people well, unless they've got childcare provided, unless someone's cooking for them, like then if you're doing all that, you can have a more representative and engaged group. But if people are just sort of being asked to participate for free, they don't have time, is the reality.
Some of those travel perks that the big the big politicians use could maybe get
exactly
divvied up
right.
a bit
Like,
better.
I mean, politicians are paid big salaries, and that's because, like, who would sit through that stuff for free, right? If you weren't getting paid for it, no one's going to waste their time in that space. Any other questions or comments? I see Asli's comment there. I would think the rise in membership in the party or candidacy. Yeah, I think you're right. And we did see a gradual increase in members. But I have to emphasize that the trials I was doing were pretty small scale. Like, it's park upgrades and footpaths and stuff. There are lots of people who would have liked to have a vote on bigger stuff, like Brisbane's climate policy, or the housing policy, but because I was one Greens councillor, I didn't have the power to crowdsource those decisions. I had fairly autonomous control over these small park budgets, and so lots of people were able to participate. But I would have loved to have a participatory budgeting vote on the entire $3 billion budget of Brisbane City Council, which would have been great. And I think then we would have had a better test of like, okay, how many people are participating? How many people are interested in this? But we were really just doing small stuff in the grand scheme of things. Any other questions?
Yes. What was the best way, would you say, to announce the meetings or the votes?
Well, I had a decent office budget, so I would send a letter to every household in the electorate. So spending like $8,000 a year on printed mail. And on top of that, I had a large social media following and email newsletters. So we would use as many communication forums as possible. We tended to use the printed letters like as a recruitment, and there was a strong push to sign up to my email newsletter. So I'd be like, here are some upcoming community meetings. Here's a link to the online website, but please just sign up to my email. And I think over my 7 years, I built a mailing list of about 7,000 or 8,000 local residents. And email was probably the main form of communication, with social media second. But we had to do that printed mail as well to make sure we were reaching as broad a range of people as possible. We also just linked up with other local community groups. So I would go and give a presentation to the Parents and Citizens Association of the local schools and say, hey, by the way, we're doing this community voting, you guys should all participate. So it was relying on my existing networks and the relationships I was forming with people. I hope that makes sense. Was there another question there?
Yeah, I had a question about blockchain and its use in participatory democracy. Um, I'm sure with my basic understanding of blockchain potential that, every legitimate citizen in Australia could be giving some sort of ID that they can log in with, and that basically can't be defrauded. And, that one ID would get one vote on whatever issues. And for things such as gay marriage, for example, where it's a yes or no question and it's not terribly nuanced, you know, that could so easily be done at home on your phone. You get a little notification, oh, you need to vote on this. Do you support gay marriage? Yes or no? As an Australian citizen, boom. And then your vote gets counted, right? Like I'm sure you're aware, like that technology absolutely exists. It's very basic blockchain technology. Are you aware of that? Is there any push to use something like that in Australia? Are you aware of that happening in other countries? Like, where are we at with that?
I know, I think a few other jurisdictions have experimented with it. Honestly, for us, we just weren't that worried about people hijacking or double voting or manipulating the system. Like, there was one occasion where one lady really didn't want the bridge to St. Lucia, and she voted 80 times, and we could just see her IP address, and it was the same IP address. And I just called her up. I said, did you vote a lot of times? She's like, yes, I'm sorry, I'm so embarrassed. Like, there's a sort of, I think maybe it's kind of like remembering that people are, if you're in community with people and people feel a sort of social responsibility, they maybe do respect systems a little bit more. Maybe, like, I think blockchain is great technology, and it allows us to be really confident that no one's voting fraudulently or voting multiple times or whatever. But you can get, for me at least, I was satisfied that we had enough security just with straightforward two-factor authentication. Yeah, like, as an elected representative, I had access to the electoral roll, and so if we suspected something dodgy was going on and that someone was creating a bunch of fake accounts with fake names, I could cross-reference to the electoral roll and say, oh, is this a real person? Oh yeah, they're already enrolled to vote. I guess they're so, like, but for the scale of and significance of the decisions we were making, I just don't think it was worth anyone's time to go to the effort of defrauding. What I wonder about is, like, if we were making really, really big decisions, like decisions to allocate multi-million-dollar government contracts, then there'd be a strong financial incentive for companies to manipulate and influence. And at that point, I think, yeah, the security that blockchain provides would allow people to have more confidence in the online voting. But I also, again, I think it's an iterative thing where rather than making systems so complex and spending so much money and effort on the back end stuff to guard against the hypothetical risk of fraud, just grow the base, get more people involved. Like the first year we did it, we didn't even have two-factor authentication. We just wanted people to participate. And so people could just log on with an email address and vote online. And we were just happy that people were participating. So anything that creates more barriers, like remember we were dealing with the whole community. So we had 80-year-olds calling up my office complaining, I don't want to have to create an email address to vote on the park upgrades. Jono, can't I just tell you over the phone where I want the playground to go? And we were like, no, we really want you to vote online. Can you create an email address? But like, yeah, like you can't have too many barriers to entry. So like a blockchain voting system that requires someone to do more than 3 steps on an online form, they're just not going to participate, is my feeling or concern. But I think we'll get there, right? It's good technology. It's just a question of the amount of work you put in to set up the systems versus the actual risk of actual fraud.
It just needs to be implemented properly, and maybe, like you said, for larger scale projects which have have a higher impact on
where the stakes are really high. Yeah. But you know what's interesting is that like in Australia right now, and I think this is a good thing in general, but you can vote in a federal election without showing photo ID. Like, and the reason we've always had that is that we don't want to exclude people who don't have ID, et cetera, et cetera. But you can rock up to the polling booth, you give a name, as long as that name exists on the electoral roll, they'll accept your vote. But various randomized testing, various like cross-referencing has shown that there are very, very few instances of voter fraud or people voting multiple times. So, I mean, I'm pretty cynical of party politics and elections in general, but there are lots of people who think the outcome of an election is really important. And there are lots of people who really, really want a certain party to win or a certain party to lose. But even when the risk of getting caught is very, very low, and you can just rock up to a polling booth and vote without showing photo ID, and then you could drive a kilometer away and vote at another polling booth under another name, and then you could drive, like, it would be very easy for someone in a day to vote 50 or 100 times. They could just come back to the same polling booth later in the afternoon. The polling booth officials would have changed shift. You can very easily vote multiple times in Australian elections, but no one bothers. So I guess maybe that tells us that the risk of fraud isn't as high as we might fear.
I suppose my question is more about faith that the populace would have in the risk of the election being rigged by the politicians, right? So if you knew that it's on blockchain, it's fully transparent, it can be vetted by a third party because it is transparent and it's almost impossible to fuck with, then I feel that potentially, I know for me personally anyway, I'd be much more interested in politics if I knew that that was the system. And then your voice was actually counted. And I do believe it would save a hell of a lot of cost if if that system existed, and then everyone could just get online around Australia and vote on items, and then there's no debate. It's like, this is what the country wants. Push ahead with option A. Okay?
Yeah. I mean, I'm very much on board with the direct democracy stuff. I think often, and Natasha sort of alluded to this, often questions are more complex and nuanced than just, do you want option A or option B? And so much of the power sits with whoever is drafting and framing the question. Someone like, we can have these long crowdsourced approaches of framing the question, and there are some countries that have citizen-initiated referenda. I think Switzerland does a lot of them.
I was about to ask about that, yeah.
Yeah, so any random member of the public, if they get a few hundred people to sign a thing, they can say, all right, we've now got to have a region-wide vote on this thing. And like, that's cool. But like, what more often happens is just that it's some powerful people somewhere are deciding what the question will be. So I think that's, in terms of trust, like, yeah, people are skeptical of, will the online vote be valid? Will the politicians just ignore the results, whatever? but there's also the question of like who's framing the question to begin with, and where does that power sit? I should also note though, and this probably will seem weird to all of us on this call, but there are lots of people who just don't trust tech, and you can give someone a really detailed explanation of what blockchain is and how it's like verified and how secure it is and how unhackable it is. But I know my dad is just going to be like, blockchain? No, I don't trust that. Like he trusts the pen and the paper, and like because like polling booth officials, like there's all this transparency around, like you can watch them count the votes and they tip out the box and they're there on the table and everyone's closely watching how they're counted. Like that analog form of accountability and transparency is more transparent to some people. It feels less hackable. I don't know. It's like we all have a lot of faith in technical solutions because we understand how the tech works and we have some level of trust in these systems. But if our goal is maximizing trust in sort of the legitimacy of these systems, not everyone trusts technology in one way or another. I don't know. That's a broader conversation as well. I'm mindful of time, Coops. I'm sorry this has gone much longer than your agenda.
No,
planned.
don't apologize. It's brilliant stuff. My only concern is if people want to drop off. I don't know if I'm happy to keep going personally. I'm learning a lot, and I think it's really relevant for what we're doing.
I'm happy to stick around for another 10 minutes or so, and we can see. Yeah.
So one thing I do want to do is kind of give an overview of what we're planning for the next month, particularly while we have you on the line, John. It would be great to get your thoughts and also, yeah, the broader community, just see what people think. So maybe I'll jump in and I'll just kind of present that briefly, and then we've still got 10 minutes to chat about that or other stuff if we want to continue the discussion. Thanks, Jono. That was amazing, as I assumed it would be. Yeah, and also lots of really relevant stuff for what we're planning at like some of the things I noticed or noted down is about how you said we need experts on top, experts on tap, not experts on top. Like this is part of the goal of what we're developing with this model, is that we can recognize the value that people add over time, and then we can play with different models. So we can look at versions where the model is weighting experts based on what they know, and other models which are just giving everybody an equal vote. And also like another thing that you mentioned, I shouldn't be sharing slides, I'm distracting everybody already, but when you mentioned about like direct versus participatory democracy, the idea is that yes, at its first and foremost, we are, it's like a direct democracy system. So the votes that people are making are designed to allow everybody, they're designed in a very simple, inclusive way that everybody can have their say about what's important to them. But we can also recognize more deliberative processes. So for example, we've actually already started to prove this with the experiment last month, where we had a lot of votes going on, and those were the sort of initial way that we recognize and reward people's contributions. But we've also logged the people that have contributed to that discussion. So the people who turned up to the meetings and engaged and were part of that deliberative process. And so in the future, we can also find a relative value for that deliberative process as well. And so I guess the goal of the project is to try and, well, make the valuation of all those different types of contributions possible, but then find the ideal mix between, say, direct or participatory democracy, and then experts being in charge versus experts just providing information. So yeah, that's just some reflections on that amazing discussion. Thanks, everybody. This is a very quick window to the next month. So the other main use case that has come up through discussions with communities is exactly this, like could we use this system to elect people? And so what I thought, and I've since cleared with the board, is that we could potentially run an experiment to elect our incoming committee, because we are backed by a charity and we have these amazing 7 humans who are currently on our board. And I want to start by thanking them for shepherding the ship the last year. So Kaylee, Alicia, James, Laura, Gabrielle, Melissa, and myself. So it's been a relatively quiet year because we've been building the system in the background. This year is expected to be a lot more active now that the system's coming online. And our current process is just a very standard way to elect people to a charity board. It's basically a vote of the members, and it's just a majority vote in the AGM, which will be held next month at the new moon. And so we could do that again, but figured we have this system and we're prototyping new use cases. So why not use it as an example for how we could participatory elect people into like positions of responsibility. And so that could be, if we run this experiment, it would be one of our goals is to just test and use this as a learning case for how we might vote people onto a board. We could do this over the same set of councils like we did for last week. So this week is really setting the intentions, setting the stage for what will come. Next week, we could nominate people. So inviting everybody, anyone who's interested to put themselves or put somebody else forward with their permission, obviously. And that could include, say, a little description about the person and maybe some relevant experience. And then we could, the next week, we could come together again and we could vote using our prototype on people, electing people into that role. And then the final week could be coming together again and deciding how we want to deal with that data and who we elect. So this is an idea. There's still a lot of questions that we'd need to address, like what dimensions do we actually measure on? How do the descriptions look? Do we actually have enough people that want to run? Because past years have largely been, it's a largely thankless role that tends to happen in the background. And it's really, really critical, but it tends to be relatively boring because it's kind of some box ticking and, writing of reports and that kind of thing. So one thing that I thought we could play with throughout the year is recognizing and rewarding people. So obviously our goal is to recognize and reward all value that is added to this community, and that includes people who sit on the board. And so we have been in the past and will continue to track people's efforts, but potentially we could also recognize and reward through the same system. So people that are sitting on the board could be recognized for that role that they played. And this would then be another learning opportunity for how we can incentivize, recognize, and reward people for the value that they create. So that's a basic idea. I haven't really, I didn't add any more details. I would be curious to hear what people think about this, if you think it's a good idea. This is really, I would see it as a very, very small step towards the type of dynamic participatory democracy that we'd like to see in the future. But potentially throughout the course of this year, we could also start to play with more detailed mechanisms as our app comes online. So curious what people think. Curious what you think, Jono, like about this as a process. I guess the main thing that we'd be testing again is this kind of incentive mechanism where people would be incentivized to vote. And so I guess like kind of coming back to some of the stuff you said, like where you were getting around 3% response rate, the idea is that we'd be incentivizing people, recognizing the value of their vote so that they are encouraged to add more votes into the system and add more data about the relative value of people, or not value of people, the priorities about who they'd like to see become part of the board. So yeah, any thoughts? Would welcome them.
I mean, just as a quick one, like if you don't have a lot of people who are jostling to be on the board, then the effort of running an election seems like extra work when, like if you've only got 5 or 6 people and you've got 6 or 7 roles that you need to fill, then like you don't need to have an election. You just have some deep open conversations about who will be best for which roles and what, like in the volunteer groups I've been part of in the past, even when there have been 2 or 3 people who will want to do the same role, we just split up the role or we compartmentalize and say, oh, you're interested in it. So like, I don't know that, I think it's cool to be looking for opportunities to trial different forms of voting, but I also don't think that you necessarily need to have votes for committees which are volunteer based and where it's a struggle to get people to do them. I think, like I don't know, that's just my initial reaction.
No, I think you're probably spot on. I was thinking if we don't get enough nominations, there's actually lots of other things we could use the rest of the month for. So I was just going to kind of see how next week rolled. but I think you're probably right. Like at this stage, there's not a huge swell of, we don't have too many people clamoring to jump on the board. So it might be a whole waste of time, but I figured it's still a step towards, learning and exploring a process. Welcome. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I'm still just really interested in the need to quantifiably value contributions, because I've been involved in lots of radical community projects or like non-profit orgs and stuff where some people do more work than others, people do what they can, and like it doesn't seem to matter too much that some people are working harder than others, because if someone feels like they're being exploited, they'll just drop back and do less work. So I'm interested in, like, at the end of the day, what is the underlying goal of putting so much effort into quantifying and valuing? Is it what's the end game there? Is it just to ensure that there aren't too many freeloaders who are like taking advantage of the community? Or
in some way, yeah. I mean, the underlying motivation is, as Damo says, to reward and incentivize people. So the idea is if there are people that are giving more than their fair share and constantly giving to their communities, those are the people we really want to elevate and celebrate, because they are lifting everybody else up with them. But quite often what happens, at least in my experience and discussion with community leaders, is burnout. And those people that aren't getting recognized and rewarded and celebrated for their efforts and supported by their community tend to burn out. And then that, structure collapses because they were the sort of top of the pyramid and keeping everybody moving. So that's some part of it. I see it as fairness personally. Like, I'm coming from an academic background, and what's interesting is hearing you talking about like the struggles that you have to get people to engage is a very similar problem that we have in academia, getting people to engage in what is ultimately a voluntary pursuit of peer review. And the problem is, because it's voluntary, it's left to the people that have spare time and are, privileged enough to have time and resources to be able to donate their time. So that's already a bottleneck. It's already a limiting factor. But secondly, as people get more and more, there's less and less time, and there's more and more competition. There's less and less free hours to go around. And so the alternative systems that could already be doing a much better job than the current outdated status quo just don't get the level of support that they need. And so the motivation for this model is coming from that space, is finding a kind of, I think of it as like the root, like when you boil peer review and evaluation down to its simplest components, this is what I think this model is, because it's a relative valuation system, and it boils the valuation process down into the very simplest of process, which is just this versus that. And that's something that anyone can participate in a really small amount of time, and they can add a meaningful data point to the collective valuation process. And so what it does, or it aims to do, is make that like engagement with that system as simple and inclusive as possible, while then creating a seed that can grow into other more complicated forms of valuation. So that was a fairly long-winded answer, but I think, that kind of tries to get it. I don't know, try to answer your question.
No, I see where you're coming from. I get it. It's it's interesting to me, because if the reward is points, but the points aren't transferable, it like what is the incentive really? Like, I'm not meaning to be critical, but I'm like, I think it's interesting to be like, okay, cool. I could do a lot of work and I'll get some omnoms or whatever. And that'll make me feel good maybe on some level, but I'd probably just volunteer my time because I want to help a project that I'm passionate about. And that's its own reward for me, maybe. But
yeah. So I think we're juggling and we're walking a fine line between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. And I think it's going to be a learning process to see how this affects people, because I think there will be some people that will be turned off by the idea of an extrinsic reward, where there are other people that will need an extrinsic reward because they literally don't have the time or resources to contribute without being supported by the community. And I guess the point of ownership it's still, to be honest, not entirely clear in my mind how this is going to play out, because what we're talking about is a gifting system. Like, we're talking about a system where people are supported in their basic needs and free to give to their community. And so they can then be recognized and rewarded for the gifts that they give. And it's not that you couldn't transfer it or convert it into something. It's more that the community can then gift back to you. So if you have a bunch of omnoms and you're in positive credit, and there's a gathering coming up that you'd like to attend that the community has organized, then you could put your hand up and say, hey, I'd like to go to that gathering. And because you already have a positive credit, you'd be allowed in, basically. You'd be invited by the community. And so it's not that you can't use it for things, it's just that the dynamic shifts, because it's not something that you own, it's something that is gifted to you by the community. And the system is aiming to do all of that account keeping in the background, so that we don't need to argue about what things are worth, and we don't have to like barter about how much this is worth and how much that's worth. Like, in theory, the system will take care of the kind of accounting in the background. But yeah, I mean, it's all very theoretical, and it's all yet to be tested. So I can only do a lot of hand waving, as I've been doing. Great question, though. Thank you. Yeah, so we're kind of running over. Are there any questions, any final questions for Jono or myself? It might still lead to depression if one is constantly comparing the value contribution contributed to each member of the community as opposed to one's own.
I was going to say that there could be a reverse effect, like something like that the leaderboard kind of idea, you might end up actually putting people off. Like,
it's possible.
yeah.
This is something we're going to have to explore. We're going to at it and see how it is making people feel. Personally, if I do a little bit of effort, I would be happy to receive a little bit of credit for the little bit that I do. And I think the way it's set up is allows people, it's creating pathways for people to add more value. So like, there's literally any way you can possibly think of to add value, but at a very simple level, do more reviews. And that's something that everybody can do. It doesn't take any degree of expertise. It just takes a little bit of time, which is something that most people have at least. So hopefully it creates pathways for people to kind of, if they are concerned about how they're looking on the scoreboard, then they can engage and they can rise up through the ranks if that's important to them. If not, they don't need to. But yeah, I guess it's something we'll just need to observe and learn about, because I don't know, we're doing something pretty new that hasn't been tested. So maybe we have an internal leaderboard instead of a public one. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I think, I mean, right now we've, like, that table that I showed in the slide was just the Council series. There's also, like I said, a whole backlog of work. We have a bunch of prototypes, so there's a secondary scoreboard that we haven't really aggregated yet. Sorry, private message. Sorry, Nudge, I'm gonna ask you here, but he asked, where's my hat? That's a good question. I don't have my revolutionary hat on. Sorry, Nudge.
I like your head. You can show us your head.
Okay, it's here. It's inside. I don't need it, but you're right. Yeah. Okay, it's official. Yes.
That pink blur was giving you a tan. Now you've got your hat. You're protected.
Oh, that's good. You got some contrast now.
I'm just going to dash, but it was great to see your face, Coops and Jono, and to meet a few other people. But I'll hopefully see you guys again soon. Bye.
Thanks for joining. Yeah, and on that note, I think we probably should wrap up because we're well over time. But yeah, I want to thank everybody. It's been an amazing session. I was just going to bring up the sorry, trying to share screen one last time, but not finding it. Can you see my screen? Can you see some QR codes?
You can see your chats.
You can see my chats?
Yeah.
Oh, whoops.
Oops. Delete.
I was like, why is he showing us his WhatsApp?
Oh man, edit that out of the video. Anyway, trying to show you some QR codes for people to get involved, but I'll put them in the recording anyway. Thanks everyone. Appreciate your time. Thank you, Johnny, especially for joining and sharing.
Thank you. Such a pleasure. Nice to meet all of you. Thanks for having me. See you guys later.
Till next time.
Guys.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.